This is Eric Haywood, and you're watching the TV Writer Podcast.
Hosted by Gray Jones, the TV Writer Podcast is brought to you by Script Magazine and ScriptMag.com, the leading source for scriptwriting information in print and on the web. And by Final Draft scriptwriting software, the entertainment industry standard for scriptwriting worldwide. My name's Gray Jones, and I want to welcome you to the TV Writer Podcast, partner of Script Magazine, episode 27 for Monday, July 4th, 2011. I want to wish a very happy Independence Day to all of you Americans out there, and for those who are Canadian, happy Canada Day. Just happened over the weekend, and I guess if you're in France, the 14 juillet, I want to wish you a very happy 14 juillet as well. But on to our podcast. Today, I'm so excited to bring you an interview with writer-director Eric Haywood. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Eric in a moment, but first, a few news items. I'm going to really race through these because some of them you've heard before, but definitely do pay attention. One of them is, I forgot to mention it last week, Elephant Bucks by Sheldon Bull. I'm going to be interviewing Sheldon on July 18th. So you want to make sure to read that book if you haven't already and get your questions in by Sunday, July 17th, to make sure to get your questions asked in the interview. You can buy that book at tvwriterpodcast.com. Just go to the store. There's his book as well as many, many others. Great prices. All of it run through Amazon.com. But if you buy through the site, it helps to support the podcast. Would be very grateful. Sunday nights, make sure you take part in the TV Writer Chat at 6:30 p.m. Pacific or 9:30 p.m. Eastern. You can get the details at tvwriterchat.com. Another website to go to is the tvwriterpodcast.com site. Make sure while you're there, I'm going to highlight a few things quickly. The schedule page, you can find out who's coming, and you can make sure to get your questions in on time. There's a TV Writer Twitter database with over 700 TV writers and continues to climb. There's, as I mentioned, a store to stock up on great TV writing books. You can support the podcast while you do that. And speaking about supporting the podcast, there's also a PayPal donation link. Your donations go a long way, and I'm really, really thankful for them. One note that I don't think I've mentioned on the podcast before is some servers have difficulty connecting to the website for some strange reason. I'm trying to figure out why, but until I do, if you ever try to get to the tvwriterpodcast.com site and you can't, you can always go to blip.tv/tvwriterpodcast. That's blip.tv/tvwriterpodcast. All of the episodes are there, and so you can watch them through that. Or on iTunes, you can search for TV Writer Podcast and get all of the episodes through iTunes. So that's it for the news, and now on to a bio about writer-director Eric Haywood. Eric was born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He began his career as a music video director while still enrolled at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in filmmaking. After relocating to Atlanta, Eric went on to direct and produce videos featuring such artists as Usher, CeeLo Green, Outkast, New Edition, Ice-T, Tupac Shakur, and legendary Parliament Funkadelic bassist Bootsy Collins. His video for Bay Area rapper E40's song Sprinkle Me was selected by MTV and XXL magazine as the number 10 greatest West Coast rap video of all time. Eric then turned his focus to writing and moved to Los Angeles, where he landed jobs as a writer on Showtime's Soul Food, the series, and NBC's police drama, Hawaii. Along the way, he has periodically returned to his filmmaking roots, writing and directing 3 short films, Staring at the Sun, Intersection, and Nick of Time, each of which has screened at a number of different film festivals around the country. Most recently, Eric wrote the Hallmark Channel original movie Relative Stranger, starring Eric LaSalle and directed by Charles Burnett. After premiering in the spring of 2009, the film garnered 3 NAACP Image Award nominations and a Best Supporting Actress Emmy nomination for Cicely Tyson. You're going to love the interview with Eric Haywood. Let's roll. Enjoy. This is Gray, and I'm here with writer-director Eric Haywood. How you doing, Eric?
I'm doing great, man. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thanks. And I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you rushed home to get to this interview, so I know that people will be very thankful that you did that.
Not a problem.
Cool. And so I'm very curious about your path, because you've done a whole bunch of different things, and I especially want to hear about the TV and TV movie writing. But I think it's very helpful for people to hear the other parts of your path as well, because all of us take little turns in our careers, and sometimes it can be hard to understand how to get from one part of the industry to another. So
right.
So I think it will all be very, very interesting and helpful. But first of all, let's start with where you really got started, and that's that you were born in Milwaukee.
Yes, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, born and raised.
Mm-hmm. And so you went to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So, and at that point, you were already studying filmmaking. So
Yes.
At what point did you decide, I want to do film?
I think it was I know it was the summer before my senior year in high school, because that was when I discovered there was such a thing as film school. Mm-hmm. I hadn't, grown up in the Midwest. I had no idea about, UCLA's film program or USC or NYU or any of those places. I had been in love with the idea of being a filmmaker since I was very, very small, had no idea how to get from point A to point B. Mm-hmm. And once I realized that you could actually, I just always I grew up assuming that people who made movies just sort of, materialized out of thin air or, descended from the clouds and just walked into a career making movies. I didn't know you could study and train to become a filmmaker. It was kind of a mind-blowing concept when I first realized. I mean, I knew you could go to school to learn to be a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant or, any number of other things. But the idea of going to school to learn how to make movies was a little bit of a revelation. So that gave me a little bit of a path to begin to follow. So I enrolled, not having enough money to be able to afford places like UCLA or USC or NYU. I looked sort of closer to home and found right in my backyard, the local university had a film program, and I signed up, and I never really looked back from that point.
Mm-hmm. Now, just a side question: were you a Star Wars kid?
It's funny. It's funny that you asked that. Star Wars was literally the movie that made me fall in love with movies, and it's sort of almost a cliched answer. Mm-hmm. For people of a certain generation, but without question, I specifically remember seeing Star Wars. I mean, not always, even, before Star Wars was released, I always, had a really strong affection for movies. But I remember sitting in the movie theater in Milwaukee and watching Star Wars, and my mind was just completely and totally blown. Yeah. I was like, somebody made this. This is unbelievable. And from that point forward, there was really never any other option for me other than some sort of life with filmmaking. But like I said, I didn't know how to get from point A to point B at the time when I first saw Star Wars. But that literally was the movie that sort of, set me on fire, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, and the reason I know that, I went to film school in 1990 and literally, when I went to film school, the teacher asked around the class, why did you get into film? Why did you get into film? Why did you get into film? And it was the generation that everybody said Star Wars, Star Wars,
Absolutely.
Star Wars, Star Wars, Star Wars.
I don't think for the generation of people who were inspired by Star Wars, I don't think money had anything to do with it. I think we were all probably too young to really be aware or care about things like, it was a summer blockbuster and it made, so many hundreds of millions of dollars. That was all that awareness, at least for me, came much, much later. Mm-hmm. It was really, really just this visceral reaction to seeing these images on a screen that just seemed like they were plucked right out of somebody's imagination. And I felt like if somebody can do that, if I can figure out how to do that, then, I'll be happy for the rest of my life.
Yeah, no, I can totally relate. And I mean, obviously not just Star Wars, but that really opened up, I think, a golden age of summer blockbusters. I mean, you had the Raiders of the Lost Ark, and you had all the Star Trek movies, and so much of that imagination happened around then. All the great Superman films, and
Of course, there are those people who feel like Star Wars was sort of the death of the sort of classic 70s American cinema, because it became all about the summer blockbuster, the tentpole movie, the Star Wars, and like you said, the Indiana Jones and the Jaws and the what have you. But, it's just a sort of a different way of looking, a different side of the same coin, I think.
Yep, absolutely. Well, let's move back to university. You got to work right away. I mean, you started directing music videos while you were still in school. Tell me about that.
Well, the goal from the time that I enrolled in college was to write and direct features. But again, I still wasn't quite clear on what the exact steps were going to be. I just knew that I just didn't want to waste any time. And I knew that I needed as much on-the-job training as I could possibly get. So at a certain point, I literally, I figured out, well, I'm in Milwaukee. I don't have access to, the pools of acting talent that they have on the East Coast and the West Coast. And I looked around and I recognized that there were a lot of up and coming local musicians in the Milwaukee area. They didn't have record deals, but, they had a little bit of money, and it was the MTV was sort of at its height at the time, and everybody wanted a music video. And I realized, well, if I can get work as a music video director, not only can I get paid to direct, but I can use the budgets from these projects to get my hands on bigger and better equipment than my school was, had on hand. And that's exactly what I did. So literally went to Kinko's and printed up some plain black and white business cards that said Eric Haywood, director, and started sort of, passing them around town until someone finally was foolish enough, with my extremely limited experience, to give me enough money to direct a video for them. And then that project led to a second video. And then, it sort of began to snowball. And the next thing I knew, I had a fairly thriving music video directing career.
Now, tell me just a little bit, here in Canada, because I'm in Toronto, a lot of how music videos happen is with government assistance. People will apply for grants to the government to get production money to shoot music videos. How are these? At the time, how were these financed? Like, were you paid a good amount for the videos, and how did people rally the funds together to do these?
Well, were they good amounts? Well, good is certainly relative. When you are in your 20s and in college, and spending a few $100s on one of your student class projects feels like an arm and a leg. To talk someone into giving you $10,000 to $15,000 to do a music video, it certainly felt like it was $1 million at the time. So, like I said, good is definitely relative, but it was certainly, those early videos the budgets were certainly more money than I had ever seen in my life at one time. But for the kinds of work that I was doing, there was certainly no government assistance. It was all privately financed. Someone sets up a small independent record label, and they raise capital, however, through hook or crook. And literally, I feel like some of my earliest clients, I think I have enough distance now that I can say this, probably came across their funds through questionable means, and felt like, this is a legitimate business venture, this record label that I'm starting. And so I have to act like a record label and make some music videos. So I had, long before anybody ever heard the term "don't ask, don't tell," I sort of had a "don't ask, don't tell" policy when it came to where my clients got their money. My thing was, you're hiring me to do this specific job. I'm going to do the job and do it well. And, and then we'll go on about our separate business. So, and then as my career began to pick up, I actually started getting work from quote unquote legitimate, established, name recognizable record companies, and sort of kept the ball rolling from there.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll get to some of those names in a second, but first you did something that was a little bit interesting. When I read your bio, you moved to Atlanta.
Yes.
And usually when people are, their careers are starting to pick up, that's when they might make the move to New York or LA. What was it that motivated the move to Atlanta?
Well, first of all, some of those early clients of mine, I had shot in Atlanta quite a few times and really, really enjoyed it. I liked the city. I liked the crews that I worked with. Mm-hmm. And I also had to weigh the option of going from Milwaukee to somewhere like LA or New York. And I just assumed that if I went to LA or New York, I would just be a really, really small fish in a really huge pond. Whereas Atlanta was a nice medium-sized market. And at the time, in the early to mid 90s, there was a really booming film industry in Georgia in general, and Atlanta in particular. And there also was a booming Black music scene. And there were record companies down there. There was a lot of rap and R&B artists who were coming out of Atlanta, or they were coming from other parts of the country and migrating to Atlanta because they were a lot of people were calling it the new Motown at the time. And I felt like, you know what, I'm familiar with Atlanta. I have connections that I've established there, and I have a better shot at being a bigger fish in a medium-sized pond if I go that route. So that took me from Milwaukee to Atlanta, where I stayed for several years. And even though I was based in Atlanta, I still got to the point where I was getting work. I shot, Atlanta was my base of operations, but I did projects all over the country, LA, New York, Chicago, Houston, but Atlanta was a good place to be for several years.
Well, and that must have been smart because you have worked with some big names. Oh my goodness. I mean, to read the list, Usher, CeeLo Green, Outkast, New Edition, Ice-T, Tupac Shakur. Bootsy Collins, like crazy names.
Yeah.
So tell me about working with some of these stars.
What's funny at the time, I don't want to name any names, but at the time when you are working fairly regularly, there's a certain sort of, business mindset that you have to have. Like, you get over being starstruck very quickly. Mm-hmm. There were a few artists that I literally grew up listening to that I got to a point where I was either directing or executive producing videos of theirs. And sometimes, when you actually work with people up close, you begin to view them strictly as a client and not so much as they're the client who's driving you over budget.
Oh, no. Yeah.
With all their crazy requests and all of their, showing up 3 hours late and stuff like that. So it was great. I don't want to knock it by any means, but it was certainly stressful working with the music industry because it operates on a sort of a whole different mentality. It's like there's a very not the healthy respect for punctuality that people who know me know I tend to gravitate towards. So there's a lot of hair pulling back in those days, but it was all about getting the best finished product you could get. So I tend to think back on those years pretty fondly, but I do also remember there were some sleepless nights on some of those shoots.
Well, and I'm sure you got some other recognitions, but one of them that you got was the number 10 greatest West Coast rap video of all time. That's by MTV and XXL magazine.
Yes.
And that was the song Sprinkle Me. Tell me about that accolade.
Actually, I don't even know if accolade is the right word. I actually found out about that completely through the grapevine. There was no, they never notified us. There was no, plaque or certificate or ceremony. There was no big deal made of it. Someone one day said to me, asked me sort of the same question you just did. They were like, well, what happened with that award you guys got? And I was like, what are you talking about?
Oh, no.
And I had to actually go look for the copy of XXL magazine that listed, they did a whole spread on I think it was the 25 or the 50 greatest West Coast rap videos. And one of the ones that I did was there at number 10. So it was surprising, and in a way, sort of not surprising in the sense that that was how I found out. Because sometimes, these things are put out there more for the public than they are for the people who actually made the projects happen. So I literally never got a phone call, a letter, or anything from the people who put that list together. I still, claim the acknowledgement. It's a nice little feather in the cap, but it was actually, sort of an early indication of how, you can do a lot of work and not necessarily get the accolades that people might think you get.
Well, so you were doing really, really well with these videos, working with some huge names. And then came a shift finally to LA. So at what point did you decide I want to get back on that path that I started out wanting to be on?
When I got completely and totally burned out on dealing with the record industry, it takes a certain mindset to live in that world and be very comfortable in it. And the thing that I always kept in mind, and this is something that I would tell people, close friends of mine, even though I was, I had a steady career as a video director, I never really felt like I was a music video director. I felt like I was a feature filmmaker who was masquerading as a music video director, because I never once, for 1 minute, took my eye off the goal of wanting to make movies. Music videos was a way to make a living, but it was also a way to continually get hands-on experience. There were times when, what you do is a record company sends you a song, you listen to it a million times, and you come up with a concept. You write a treatment and you submit it along with your budget, and you basically, you're bidding on the project. And there were times when I would specifically write certain things, pieces of equipment, into the concept, because I wanted to be able to use it and learn how it worked and get paid to do it.
Wow.
So I specifically remember, jibs and cranes and steady cams that I would sort of weave, and, in a subtle sort of way, I would weave into the concept so that when the record company executive showed up on set and saw the Steadicam there, or they saw, the line item in the budget, they would know that it was there for a specific reason. But my ulterior motive was, I want to get to know how Steadicams work. I want to watch this guy and see what they can do and figure out how I can apply this one day to a narrative project. So in a weird sort of way, it was never that big a leap for me to go from music videos, to moving to LA, because that was always the ultimate goal.
Now, what were you writing at the time? Because you must have had some samples, because in 2000 you got staffed on Soul Food. What were the samples that you gave them, and what were you doing up to that point?
What's funny is music video directing was my day job, but early mornings and late nights were almost exclusively dedicated to writing. Even before I ever heard the term spec script, I didn't know, what that meant, but I knew what a screenplay was. And I was writing a bunch of feature screenplays just to learn the craft and sharpen my writing skills. So I had a bunch of scripts, some of which, some of them were better than others, but one feature script in particular ended up being my sort of calling card to Los Angeles. That script ended up, after several years, getting bought by the Hallmark Channel and turned into the TV movie Relative Stranger.
Interesting. Okay.
In its original form, that script was one that I wrote for myself to direct. And the idea was I was going to direct that movie for basically no money in Atlanta with all unknown actors, and use that as a calling card to show people that, I can, take a movie from concept to completion. And I ended up circulating that script to a couple of friends who were working in Los Angeles just to get some feedback. Because I was actually raising money, and I was gearing up to shoot this movie. And it ended up sort of like the XXL magazine thing. Things have a way of happening sort of behind the scenes that you don't even really know about, or you may not be aware of at the time. So that script ended up getting passed around by a lot of people. And it ended up in the hands of a woman named Felicia Henderson, who was staffing for Soul Food, the series, which was the spin from the feature.
Yeah.
And she read the script. It was a Black family drama, kind of in the vein of the show she was putting together. And that led to me getting an offer to write a freelance episode for the first season of her show. And then that sort of snowballed into a job offer to come on board the actual writing staff for the second season. And the next thing I knew, I was a television writer.
Wow.
I can acknowledge that at the time, I was completely and totally a film snob. I felt like if it's not on the big screen, it doesn't quite count. You know, TV is cool, but it's not as special as getting people to come out of their homes and pay, you know, for a movie theater ticket. But once I actually got on board the staff of Soul Food, I saw that unlike one feature script that may take, you know, several years to get made, when you're on the staff of a TV show, you're pitching ideas, you're writing scripts, those scripts are getting shot, those episodes are you know, getting edited and broadcast within a couple of months. And in the meantime, you're back to writing another script, you know, pitching another story, writing another script, and the wheel keeps on turning. And I realized, like, as a writer, it was the perfect place to be because I was constantly writing, as opposed to, you know, a feature, as opposed to a labor of love feature script that people may want to polish over and over and do 100 drafts. There was a lot of pressure in television to get it right, you know, the first time around because, you know, you had a tight schedule. It had to be shot. It had to be, you know, there was a broadcast date already somewhere, you know, set in stone that you couldn't overshoot. So, you know, you're in the room, in the writer's room, and you're constantly pitching, and you can't fall too in love with any of your brilliant ideas when you're on a writing staff. Because if you pitch an idea that you think is great and the executive producers don't like it, you can't pout. You have to, you know, you have to immediately say, okay, you didn't like that idea. How about this one? And figure out what it is that they're looking for that maybe your original pitch didn't quite have. So it was very much like a writer's boot camp that you got, you know, very well paid for. So I very quickly latched on to the idea of being a television staff writer. And that boot camp actually lasted a while because you were several seasons on that show, weren't you? Yeah, Soul Food ran for 5 seasons. And you were from season 2 to season 5. So season 1, you had that freelance script, and then you were on staff from season 2 to season 5? Yes. Wow. Great opportunity, man. And you did also direct a short film in that time around 2001, 2002. So you still had that urge to be a filmmaker. Yeah, you know, when I think back on it, and I usually don't think back on it that much because I'm too busy, you know, trying to figure out what I'm, you know, doing now and what I'm doing next. But when I have conversations like this one and I think back, I begin to recognize certain patterns in my own behavior. So yeah, even when I was writing for television, the goal was still to be a filmmaker, because one of the biggest educations that I got when I joined the Soul Food staff, you know, I would always hear that film is a director's medium, but TV is a writer's medium. And as a writer, I thought, well, this is great, you know, because I'll get to, you know, really hone my writing skills. But the thing that I learned that nobody ever really, you know, emphasizes is, yes, TV is a writer's medium, but you're not there like a Broadway playwright to see your own individual vision on the TV screen every week. You're there specifically to service the showrunner's vision of that show. So in a way, you have to learn how to take the best of your own voice and sort of blend it with the voice of the show, which is another good skill, a very good skill to have. So as great as that was, it was still, you know, someone else's voice that you had to sort of figure out how to mimic every time you got assigned an episode to write. So I still had the directing bug. I still wanted to, you know, sort of write and direct my own stuff. And it had been a few years since I had left the music video world behind. And I felt like, you know, I really want to get back to kind of flexing those directorial muscles that I haven't used in a while. So I wrote and directed a short and, really began to remember why I got into this thing in the first place. I realized like, yes, this is what I want to do. I love working on someone else's show and having, I didn't have to deal with the headaches of dealing with the network and the studio. That was all the executive producer's responsibility. Mm-hmm. All I had to do was pitch ideas and write them. But I also had a craving for a little taste of that responsibility. I wanted to be able to say, this is something that I thought of, that I wrote, and that I directed, and it was sort of, has my fingerprints on it all the way through.
Mm-hmm. And we'll get to some of your other directing projects in a minute, but in 2004, you also did NBC's police drama Hawaii. So
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about this. Was only your second experience now with
Yes.
a TV staff. How did you get that gig, and what was that room like compared to Soul Food?
I got that gig because I wrote a spec script for The West Wing
mm-hmm.
that, I guess I can say this without sounding like I'm patting myself on the back.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote it had sort of a twist ending that I was later told made the showrunner's wife cry.
Oh, wow.
And she took it to the showrunner and said, you have to read this. And, that ended up getting me the job on Hawaii. And as happy as I was to have that job, it was in the early stages pretty terrifying, because when I was on Soul Food did very well for Showtime, the network that it was on, but it was still sort of, it was a pay cable channel. It was a little bit of a niche.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Hawaii, I felt like I was really stepping into a major broadcast network primetime situation. Mm-hmm. And I just felt like I was nervous because I wasn't quite sure if I had what it took to be able to survive in that environment creatively. But I was also intrigued because I felt like, what? This is great, because it was cool being on Soul Food, but this is NBC now. And I'm actually going to be able to see firsthand how they really make the magic of major network television.
Mm-hmm.
So I got in there, and for the first month or so, I was completely and totally intimidated. I hardly pitched anything.
Oh, no.
And then one day it just sort of clicked. I realized like there were producers and co-EPs on Hawaii who had come from some pretty big name shows. So I was intimidated just, even being in the room with them. But after the first few weeks, I looked around and I said to myself, you know what? They're doing the process of doing this show, as far as writing it, is exactly the same as what we used to do on Soul Food.
Mm-hmm.
You sit around the room, you bounce ideas off the wall. There's a big white dry erase whiteboard that somebody gets up and writes notes on. And even the most experienced writer in the room might pitch an idea that the showrunner shoots down.
Mm.
And the least experienced person in the room might pitch an idea that the whole room falls in love with. And then we begin kicking that around and it becomes an episode.
Mm-hmm.
So I realized like the only difference between Soul Food and Hawaii was one of scale. It was NBC, it was primetime. Like I said, they had more money. Mm-hmm. But as far as being a writer, the process was exactly the same. So I sort of had this little epiphany one day. And after that, all the intimidation that I felt completely disappeared. I felt like, you know what? I'm here for a reason. I deserve to be here. And I sort of saw myself as a full-fledged member of the team from that point forward, and ended up having a great time.
Great.
Now, the other difference I'll say between Soul Food and Hawaii, as we just discussed, Soul Food ran for 5 seasons, and Hawaii was a very, very heavily promoted police drama for NBC. I think there was an Olympics that year, and a Summer Olympics. And NBC promoted Hawaii. It was going to be the first of the fall shows that year to premiere. Mm-hmm. And they heavily, heavily promoted this show all through the Olympics. It was one of those things where I foolishly at the time assumed like, well, I'm set now. I made it. I crossed into the promised land of television writing. And 7 or 8 episodes later, we were canceled.
Wow.
So I went from the smaller show that went, pretty well for 5 seasons to the major leagues. And, we were all out of a job after 7 or 8 episodes. And that also was a shock to the system.
Yeah.
So there's been this sort of like continuing education process of, don't count your chickens before they hatch. You have no idea, when you're joining a brand new show, you could be joining the next CSI that goes on for, 9, 10 seasons and spawns an entire franchise, or you could be joining the next Hawaii that people think is going to be huge and doesn't make it to Christmas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for anybody who doesn't work in the industry, I do work in television as well. For anybody who doesn't work in the industry, you don't know how stressful it can be when your show is canceled mid-season because the hiring is so cyclical.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's a little different now, but especially back in 2004, most of the shows staffed in May. And so what was it like hearing that your show was dropped and at that point in the year?
Well, we were kind of dead man walking for a while because the ratings started out pretty good and then they fell off pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, if I'm remembering this correctly, and I think I am, this was the same year that Lost premiered.
Oh boy.
And both of these shows, matter of fact, it was Lost and Hawaii, and Fox had a show called North Shore.
Mm-hmm.
So all three of these shows were filming in Hawaii around the same time.
Wow.
And Lost, of course, went on to become, this instant classic, and it took off right out of the starting gate.
Yeah.
And Hawaii and North Shore kind of limped out of the starting gate. So it was pretty apparent for a while that they go through the thing of, are we going to change the time slot? Are we going to change some aspect of the show to try to save it? But by October, we pretty much knew that it was just going to be a matter of time. And then one day I heard, we got word, I was back in LA in the writer's office, and we heard that once the announcement came down from the network, the producers that we were canceled, the producers went to set and they were like in the middle of shooting a scene and they pulled the plug.
Oh my goodness.
We're done. Everybody pack up and go home. So
wow.
I think that is much more of a shock to the system when you're actually there trying to do your best to turn the ship around and somebody comes and taps you on the shoulder and says, you know what, we're not even going to let you finish filming this episode. The plug has been pulled.
Wow.
And that was it.
Wow. So, I mean, that must have been pretty disheartening. And then afterwards, what did you do?
After that, I like to say that I was plunged into unemployment for a little while because, like you said, it's cyclical. You can't. It's very difficult in October to go from a show that just got canceled to hop on to another show because every other show is already staffed.
Mm-hmm.
So I basically took a lot of meetings because there were some people. One of the other things about Soul Food was we were sort of off season.
Mm-hmm.
So because I had a job all those years on Soul Food, I didn't have to do the typical, the annual meet and greets of all the new shows and showrunners and network executives because I knew that I had a job to go back to.
Mm-hmm.
But when Hawaii was canceled, there were a slew of people that my agent was like, okay, we got to get you to meet these people and this network and these showrunners. And so I took tons of meetings, and along the way, one day out of the blue, I got a phone call from my agent saying my Relative Strangers feature script, which had continued to float around town and had been turned down by a lot of places, by a lot of networks. The Hallmark Channel read it and loved it and wanted to buy it.
Wow.
So that became, my next thing that I jumped onto. Not as, sustainable financially as being on a series where you get a weekly paycheck, but it was sort of the best of both worlds in that something I had written was getting produced and I was getting paid for it, and B, it was much more my voice than, going back to that thing of being on a TV series. Your job is to mimic the voice and tone of an established show. This was sort of my thing. And even though one of the Hallmark Channel's conditions for buying the script was that because they knew that I had attached myself as director, and they also knew that it was a very personal story for me.
Yeah.
And they said, my agent said, well, there's a catch. They're not going to let you direct it.
Oh no.
And I said, you know what? But the thing is, I had gained enough experience in the business in the years between I had moved to LA and the time that they wanted to buy this script that I understood where they were coming from. I think if I had sold that script the first couple of years after moving to Los Angeles, I would have laid down in traffic rather than let someone, bring in another director, because it was, but making a movie, whether it's a TV movie or something for theatrical release, it's a multi-million-dollar operation, and you don't want to just hand it over to someone who's directed a bunch of music videos and a couple of short films and hope he knows what he's doing.
Right.
You want to bring in somebody, it was modestly budgeted, and they needed to be sure that whoever they had as director, had enough experience to know what they were doing. And when I heard that Charles Burnett was going to direct it, I said, oh, well, this is a guy whose work that I studied when I was in college.
Wow.
So I absolutely have no qualms about stepping aside to let someone like that direct it.
Wow. And now, so that was released in, 2009?
That was it 2009 or 2008? It's a blur.
Yeah.
One of those.
Yeah.
Might have been 09.
So how was that process different from that point? I mean, it had been already written, but you must have had to rewrite it for the act to get the act breaks right. Well,
here's the good thing about that situation. There were no act breaks. It was written as a theatrical, feature. So there, like I said, there were no act breaks, but they actually didn't want act breaks because part of their approach is, we want to be able to have the freedom in post to cut to a commercial whenever we want to. So we don't want you to write it as precisely as an episode of commercial TV.
Interesting.
We'll decide where the act breaks go. Which is, sort of a necessary evil one of the other good things that I learned over my years of writing on a couple of different staffs is you have to learn how to let go of even your most personal work. And I became very practical about it after a while. It's like, look, they're paying you a lot of money. They're not going to pay you a lot of money and then let you still call the shots.
Right.
So once you sign on the dotted line and you sign that script over to them, it's theirs. It's like if you sell your house and the new owner wants to paint the whole thing blue, you don't get to say no. But you sold it. It's theirs now.
Yeah.
You can feel however you want to feel about it, but it no longer belongs to you. And if you didn't want it, if you wanted to guarantee that your house would never be painted blue, don't sell it.
Right.
It's very, very simple, which is a hard thing to learn when you are first breaking in, because you want both. You want, access, you want your foot in the door, and you also want your vision preserved. And you very rarely, in the early years of anybody's career, you very rarely get both. So being a very practical person, it was sort of easy for me to learn that lesson and realize, like, look, this is, I still consider it mine because, I spent so many years with the script. But also to answer your other question, yeah, there were tons of rewrites, and that was sort of my first introduction to Hollywood's thing where they say, we love this, we want to buy it, we want to make it, and then you get very giddy. And as soon as the check clears, they say, okay, now here's a list of 50 notes things we want you to fix and change and add and cut. And you're standing there like, wait a minute, I thought you loved it. Well, yeah, they do love it, but they also have some other concerns, or they have some, but the good thing about the Hallmark Channel was their notes were extremely smart notes. And I never once got a note from them that I just had to begrudgingly apply. Eric LaSalle, who signed on for the lead role, also had extremely smart notes. So they all helped it wasn't just a job. People were trying to actually make it the best it could be. So that was actually a great thing to be a part of.
Very, very cool. Well, and now you had another interesting shift, and that was around the same time, 2005. This was your first foray into reality TV with Foodie Call. Tell me about that.
Oh, God. Oh, what can I say? Yeah, that was my first and last brush with quote unquote reality television.
Uh-huh.
It was a job. It was something where I had gotten a contact and they said, "Hey, do you want to come work on this new show?" It was a cooking dating show.
A cooking dating show.
Yeah, where the idea was like there was a couple, and either the man or the woman would prepare some special food dish in order, to romance, their partner.
Uh-huh.
And it was, what can I say, man? It was, I think that it's probably telling that it's something that I only did once.
Uh-huh.
A lot of the things you hear about reality TV not being reality, like people say that a lot, but they say that because it's true.
Mm-hmm.
It's like there's so much that's sort of staged and manufactured, and you need to craft a little bit of a story arc for the sake of the audience.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not by any stretch of the imagination making a documentary.
Right.
And it ultimately wasn't where my interests really lie. So once again, another little sort of feather in the cap, but I was all too happy to get back into the world where, we do fiction and we acknowledge that it's fiction.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and another thing you did at the same time was another short film, Intersection. Tell me about that one.
Intersection, once again, it had been a while since I had directed. I felt like I wanted to keep those sort of directorial muscles kind of in shape. And I had a little bit of money and I had a concept that I felt was fairly easy to execute. I just had the directing bug. I mean, it was nothing more complicated or involved than that. I wanted to, once again, get back in the director's chair and have something that creatively I was solely responsible for. So with each of my shorts, they all had a healthy run at film festivals around the country. None of them won any awards, but I mean, it's always good when you write and direct something and you edit it and you kind of slave over it. And then you put it in front of an audience who doesn't know you at all. And you actually get to sit in the room with them and kind of hold your breath and hope that they laugh in the right places.
Mm-hmm.
They gasp in the right places. And that is extremely fulfilling when those moments click with an audience. So I love doing shorts. I've always liked, being able to sort of story-wise kind of get in and get out.
Very, very cool. Well, and you also did another one towards 2010, but I know IMDb often has gaps. There's a bit of a gap in that time. What were you working on sort of between 2005 and 2009, 10, around there? 2005 and 2010, a lot of feature specs, a lot of TV specs, a lot of pilots, and a lot of meetings, and trying to get on board another TV series. And I just recently, so after doing that for a number of years, and the other thing that was an obstacle that I began running into was a lot of people will, freely acknowledge this. The TV writing game has gotten tougher just purely because of the economy. Mm-hmm. I saw a lot of networks begin to cut back on the size of their writing staffs. Mm-hmm. A show that might have at one point had 10 or 12 writers is now making do with 8. Yeah. Or a show that might have had 10 writers is now making do with 6. And not only that, a lot of shows compounded that problem by hiring, they would staff on the high end and the low end, meaning you would have a bunch of co-executive producers and a couple of staff writers. Mm-hmm. And sometimes those staff writers and their, eagerness to get work would sometimes split work as a writing team on paper, even though they weren't really a writing team. So they'd be working for half the salary that they were supposed to be getting. Wow.
So the competition got really, really fierce. And I did a lot of pitching of shows. Eric LaSalle and I went out with a pitch, a couple of pitches actually. So there was a lot of, knocking on doors. And so that gap in my IMDb, on my IMDb page, is actually accurate in that it wasn't that I wasn't doing anything. It was that I was doing things. I was both writing and taking tons of meetings and pitching. And just sort of recently got to the point where I'm like, you know what? I don't really foresee things changing too much in the TV staffing game anytime in the near future. I think it's going to continue. And also the push towards, more reality shows means less scripted, drama and sitcom opportunities. Mm-hmm. So I decided to finally redirect myself and get back to the thing that brought me out to Los Angeles in the first place, which is writing and directing my own features. So I have a feature actually that I have been slaving away on for close to a year now, that I am finally arrived at a draft that I am satisfied with. So my next step is going to be shooting my first feature later this year. Great.
And so you'll be directing that as well?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, it's nice that the shows that you worked on, I'm sure, got you set up more for that. I mean, if you had tried to do that in 2000, you would just not have had the resources, I'm sure.
Oh, definitely not. I mean, there's so much information available now that's readily available in terms of, just the process of filmmaking. There are, the technology has changed. Things have gotten cheaper between the internet and cell phones and Vimeo and YouTube and Netflix. There are so many more avenues now than there used to be to get yourself in front of an audience, in addition to the more traditional routes of festivals and theatrical distribution. So I'm actually a lot more optimistic now than I probably would have been if I had, tried to go for it several years back.
Mm-hmm. Very, very cool. And so now we're at the point in the interview where we talk about tips, and you've touched a lot of different parts of the industry. Primarily we're a TV podcast, but you've also touched different parts of TV. You've worked for cable, for network, and also TV movies. So for a writer who wanted to break into any of these, what would your advice be?
Well, I would say, I think I just either yesterday or the day before saw a conversation rather on Twitter. It might have been Script Chat, I'm not sure, where people were asking about, do people want, for samples, do people want specs of existing shows, or do they want pilots? And it's all, original pilots. Mm-hmm. It's always been my experience that the answer ultimately is both. Mm-hmm. You should always have, literally every year, you should have at least one new solid TV spec and one new pilot, because there are some showrunners or networks who specifically don't want to read your original pilot. They only want to read, specs of existing shows. So once again, they can see how well you mimic an existing show. Do you get it? Did you do your homework? And then just as often, there are people who absolutely just want to see your original voice. So they don't want to see your CSI spec or your Law and Order spec or your Entourage spec. They want to see, your original work. And then they'll make their judgment off of that based on whether they think, you have talent enough to continue pursuing an interest in you. Mm-hmm. So there's really no either or. It's like your best bet is to have one of each chambered, so that whoever you encounter, if you have a great Good Wife spec and you happen to get introduced to someone, for a show or a job opportunity that will be great for you, but they don't want to read your spec. They want to read something original. You don't want the pressure of having to run home and crank out a brand new, spec pilot in a couple of days so that you don't get the opportunity. Yeah. Your best bet is really to have both on hand. And I think that applies to both drama and sitcom writing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also I think if people are applying to this industry, if they get a job, they're going to be cranking out material. So if you can't write a number of different scripts, it really doesn't show that you can do it.
Absolutely. That's the other thing. It's like if you spent, 2 years working on the perfect, house spec, that might get you in the door. But then what happens when, like I said, when you have to constantly crank out new pitches and new drafts, and you don't have the luxury of a year or two to polish it and make it pristine. You need to be able to demonstrate that you can do a variety of things rather than just do one thing really, really well.
Mm-hmm. Well, excellent advice. And I think as well, even just looking at your career path, I think there are many, many things that people can glean about how you were smart about approaching different things, like in the music videos, wanting to use the different equipment, and also it just sounds like you've been doing a lot of that writing yourself, always keeping busy. And also pursuing your passion. I really appreciate the fact that you're getting to what you love the best.
Yeah, definitely.
And sometimes it takes a while to get there, but I'm glad you're getting there.
Thank you very much, man. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and people can follow you on Twitter as well, right?
Yes, they can. As it says in my bio, I forget exactly how I worded it, but I'm not the kind of person who tweets about, any one thing all the time. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, I will sit down in front of a movie that I either haven't seen or have seen 100 times, and I'll sit and just sort of, live tweet some observations about it. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it might be something a little more personal. Sometimes it might be something a little more political. Sometimes it might just be a random thought that has nothing to do with anything. So I'm a little bit all over the map, but that's one of the things that I love about Twitter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, Twitter's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. And I guess you do pop into Script Chat so people could interact with you there.
I've been lurking the last couple of weeks, and I actually wanted. I think it was yesterday's Script Chat that I saw the discussion about samples, because I wanted to jump in and say something, but I was literally rushing to meet my self-imposed deadline of getting my rewrite finished by Sunday. Yeah. And I knew if I had started tweeting, I would get sucked in, and I'd still be working on it today. So I had to, sort of step back. But I do think in the future, I'm going to try to be a little bit more involved in Script Chat.
Mm-hmm. Very, very cool. And there's a TV writer chat as well, right after Script Chat.
Yeah, I only just heard about that, I think, through you. So I want to start checking that out a little more often.
Yeah, very, very cool. Well, I know we've run a bit longer than we originally thought. I appreciate so much you taking the time and just sharing your wisdom. It's really great to hear your path. And like I said, the fact that you're pursuing your passion and getting so many of these great projects made is really wonderful to hear. So
thank you very much.
Yeah. So thanks so much, and best of luck to you, and definitely tweet about and let me know about when your feature gets made. We want to make sure to get as many people as possible out to see that.
I will do that. Thank you very much.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Eric.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Hosted by Gray Jones, the TV Writer Podcast is brought to you by Script Magazine and ScriptMag.com, the leading source for script writing information in print and on the web. And by Final Draft script writing software, the entertainment industry standard for script writing worldwide.